All right, hello everyone. It's 3:15 exactly, so we will get started. Welcome to UC Center Sacramento. I'm Richard Kravitz, the director here. As you know, we at the center present a series of events nearly every week related to various aspects of policy, and today we're very pleased to present this panel in association with the University of California Consortium on the developmental science of adolescence. Quite a mouthful, but it's a rare thing where we can bring not only a number of distinguished scientists from our University of California campuses together all in one place, but also have the privilege of hearing from an on-the-ground policymaker. But I'll leave the specific introductions to the coordinator of this event, who I'm also very pleased to welcome, and that would be Paul Hastings, who's a professor of psychology at University of California, Davis. He's former chair of the department, well-known researcher in the field of adolescence and child development and its relationship to schools and education, and has accomplished many great things in his career and has been a wonderful colleague at UC Davis. So Paul, we're very glad that you're here with us and that you were able to assemble this amazing panel. We look forward to hearing from all of you.
Thank you, Richard. I'd like to thank you all for coming and to thank both the UC Center Sacramento, Richard and his team, and the UC Consortium on the Developmental Science of Adolescence for sponsoring this Capital Insight panel on maximizing schools' effects on the positive development of adolescents. Since 2015, the UC Office of the President has provided generous support for the UC Consortium on the Developmental Science of Adolescence, which I'm just going to start calling the consortium from this point forward, through a mechanism called the Multi-Campus Research Programs and Initiatives, which is intended to strengthen inter-campus collaborations between faculty with shared research interests and activities. The consortium is comprised of 26 faculty and more than 80 graduate students and trainees from 5 UC campuses: Berkeley, Davis, Irvine, Los Angeles, and Santa Cruz. Our collective mission is to advance the social, educational, psychological, and neurobiological science of adolescent development, to provide multidisciplinary research training to graduate students, and to promote the public understanding of the developmental science of adolescence as an important period of transition with lifelong implications for health and well-being. It is that third aim of our mission that brings us here today, to share some of the leading-edge researchers that the consortium members are doing on the critical roles of schools in the lives of adolescents. Our hope is to both provide new information to you as people who work directly on these issues, policymakers and budget deciders, and to establish new lines of communication and dialogue between the Capitol and the UC system, so that you can help us to better recognize and to better investigate the aspects of adolescent development that are going to matter for the policies that you're pursuing and the work that you're trying to do for the state. I'd like to introduce our panel members, beginning with the 4 faculty members in the order that they will be speaking. Dr. Sandy Simpkins will be joining us by telephone in a few minutes later today. She is a professor in the School of Education at UC Irvine and a recipient of the National Science Foundation Career Award. Dr. Sandra Graham is a distinguished professor in human development and psychology in the Department of Education at UCLA, where she holds the UC Presidential Chair in Education and Diversity and is a member of the National Academy of Education. Dr. Adriana Monago is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at UC Santa Cruz, and she's the recipient of early career awards from the Society for Research on Adolescence and the International Association of Cross-Cultural Psychology. Dr. Tori Wynn is the co-founder and executive director of the Transformative Justice in Education Center in the School of Education at UC Davis, and the recipient of this year's UC Davis Chancellor's Achievement Award for Diversity and Community. We're also very fortunate to have with us Superintendent Jorge Aguiar, the superintendent of the Sacramento City Unified School District. With a BA from UC Berkeley and a JD from UCLA, and having previously been the Associate Vice Chancellor for Education and Community Development and Partnerships at UC Merced, Superintendent Aguiar has deep connections with the UC, and we thank him very much for being part of our panel today. More importantly, though, Superintendent Aguiar has long been a champion for increasing access and quality of education to all children and youth in California, and an advocate for the power of K-12 education to transform the opportunities and lives of the state's children, youths, and families. We'll start today's panel with Superintendent Aguiar's perspective on the faculty's research on maximizing schools' effects on positive development in adolescence. Please join me in welcoming Superintendent Aguiar and all the panel members.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm very honored to be here and wonder if this is the best place for me to be, or I'm more used to moving around. Okay, all right. Well, let me just tell you why I'm excited to be here. Most of my time right now is being spent on addressing and overcoming our financial challenges. And yet, every once in a while I get to think and talk about what I think is one of the most critical pieces of the future of public education, and that is how do we create a stronger nexus between K-12 and higher education? So if you're wondering about my connections to UC, I became part of the founding staff at UC Merced in 1998. 7 years prior to the opening of the campus, and served, among other things, as a special assistant to the founding chancellor at UC Merced. And the idea behind the campus in Merced was that when we opened in 2005, we would have a strong representation on the campus of students from the Central Valley. The problem was that at the time, only 2% of students in the Central Valley were competitively eligible for a UC education. And we knew that the pool of applicants from Los Angeles, Southern California, and the Bay Area would be very strong to the Merced campus. So we had 7 years to partner with K-12 to increase eligibility rates so that we could at least have a third of our students on the campus coming from the Central Valley, and we actually achieved that goal. And it remains today, where about a third of the students on the Merced campus are from the Central Valley. And it was through the partnership work that we did on the Merced campus in K-12 that I realized how frustrating it was that we had not created a strong connection between higher ed and K-12. That is, that even where we had and demonstrated the research capacity of the University of California to benefit K-12 students, we had no authority to translate our research findings into new practices, policies, and procedures in K-12. And it was out of that frustration that the campus allowed me to take a leave of absence and be part of Fresno Unified School District as an associate superintendent, understanding what needed to be done in an urban K-12 school district to systemically improve outcomes for students. And we did that work for about 8+ years, where the Merced campus partnered with Fresno Unified. And we increased graduation rates from about 68% to 85%. Our A to G completion rates increased from about 25% to 48% over the course of those 8+ years, before I was invited to become superintendent in Sac City Unified. So very excited to be here. Let me give you a sense of why I think these topics are so important, and I do very excited to be in space with Dr. Nguyen, who also is a community member here in Sacramento, and all of the other faculty. I'm an avid supporter of improvement science in the work that we do, and feel very strongly that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And as such, we developed a core value statement that is very, very clear. And it states that we have designed a system in Sac City Unified that, again, by design, produces inequitable outcomes. And that our task is to disrupt those inequities and upend system features so that they produce more equitable outcomes. And I'm going to share with you how the work of our faculty members here today is practically penetrating our system. And then finally, we have a very powerful, simple but measurable guiding principle in Sac City Unified, which is that our task is to ensure that every student has an equal opportunity to graduate with the greatest number of post-secondary choices from the widest array of options. And I'll give you an example in a few minutes about how we measure this. So this is a very interesting construct, not mine. It's actually Fred Wilson, a blogger that I follow, who talks about sort of this idea of privilege and hard work and compares these two things. And I did an exercise with each of our 70-plus principals, and this was a very, very difficult exercise for our site leaders to wrestle with. To what extent are we not being honest about what hard work results in versus privilege? Particularly in a community like Sacramento, where unlike any other post that I've held, and I've taught in LA Unified, then in Fresno, Merced, et cetera, the role of gentrification in Sacramento, which I will show you in some analyses that we did earlier. This is a census map that outlines the boundaries of Sac City Unified. So you can see that bold boundary in Sac City Unified. Red marking median income households of $10,000 to $40,000 roughly, right? And you see the entire Sacramento region. You see that the only two spots, areas where you see the concentration of red census blocks, if you will, is in Sac City Unified and just up north here in Twin Rivers Unified, which is led actually right now by a superintendent who he and I worked in Fresno Unified together. If you look at then zooming in Sac City Unified, there's only 3 areas within our boundaries that don't have the concentration of red. And that's, you can see that the green areas there. So when you think about the topics that our faculty are going to talk about, I want to give a few examples of how this is highlighted in the work that we're trying to advance in Sac City Unified. I always try to spend some time interacting with our students. Every Wednesday, we launched an elementary sports program. Believe it or not, we did not have elementary sports in Sac City Unified until about a year ago. When I got here, as a parent of 4 children in Sac City Unified, my 4 kids would come home with flyers, and I realized that every single flyer offered an opportunity for them to engage in organized extracurricular activities. And when we talk about opportunity gaps, which is sort of a K-12 kind of term, what I realized is that in Sac City Unified, we've done a great job of creating opportunities, but a terrible job of investing to fill the gaps. So my kids played basketball every week, and we had to pay $90 to a city-run program for 8 weeks of basketball. We have a wonderful partnership around music with the Youth Symphony here in Sacramento, but you've got to pay $350 for one to participate in this. And then we didn't have any elementary sports programs, so we launched a flag football co-ed program, a basketball co-ed program. And last Wednesday I went to our first basketball game. And it was one of the schools in one of the green areas over here in the eastern part of our district. playing against one of the schools right in the center core of our district that has the red area. We had to change the rules mid-game because the school on the eastern front was beating the other school 45-0. And I felt terrible. We changed the rules, and they began to score a few points because they had, in fact, not been exposed to coordinated elementary athletics, right? And so this is real in terms of the advantages and the competencies that our students aren't accessing because we haven't addressed this vision of equity, access, and social justice and invested in our youth. I wanted to just very quickly, as I run out of time, we've just launched a database that allows us to identify every single student's attendance, behavior, and academic well-being. So early warning system data, which I'm very proud of because, early warning systems are typically reserved for middle and high school students. We've created a database where we're looking at early warning system data as early as kindergarten. And for every one of our students, we're able to see after every grading period how many of our students are demonstrating deficiencies in academics, in attendance, and in behavior, or any combination of those. And then we've laid out a series of protocols of first responders among our social workers, resource specialists, teachers, social workers, et cetera, to intervene on behalf of students. And this is actually a system that was developed through a partnership that we still have at UC Merced. And so I'm very excited about this. And then the final thing that I'll mention very quickly is I'm very committed to continuous improvement and accountability, as I mentioned. And so we've developed a multi-metric framework that brings together some of the work that our faculty are going to talk about. In that, if you look at, for example, what we're tracking around suspensions or chronic absenteeism or school climate, the idea of advancing transformative justice, the idea of having students engaged in the arts, in extracurricular activities and athletics, is not perceived as something that is mutually exclusive of one another. So for example, if you look at suspensions, we have among the highest suspension rates in the state in Sacramento. And so what I've said to our principals is I'm not interested in only reducing suspension rates, which is on the left-hand corner. I'm looking at reducing suspension rates from a disproportionality standpoint. How do I track disproportionality of the students that are being suspended? I also want to track through that other system that we developed, how many of our students who are displaying negative behaviors that lead to suspensions are receiving appropriate interventions? And how do we define those appropriate interventions? What does appropriate mean, right? Fourth, what are our suspension rates per 100 students? And the most important thing, which I think we have not managed to do well in the state, no matter how much I've tried to encourage the state to do this, is that it's not as critical for me in Sac City as superintendent only to reduce suspension rates or only to reduce chronic absenteeism rates without evidence that once we've improved student behaviors, once we've gotten students to come back to school from having been chronically absent, what is the rate at which those students are growing academically? And believe it or not, we are not held accountable for creating that connection in K-12. We're held accountable for reducing suspension rates on their own, reducing chronic absenteeism rates on their own. What we're trying to do in Sac City Unified is create the right connection between these data points, which is once we have intervened successfully through organized activities, through more robust transformative justice practices that are showing reductions in behaviors resulting in suspension rates, and the students are now back in school, What evidence do we have, and how do we hold ourselves accountable for demonstrating that those students are growing academically? And so I hope that you'll hear some of that from our faculty as well. But it's something that we're very committed to in Sac City Unified. And I wish I could stay here, Paul, but I do thank you for your invitation.
Yes, I'm ready. Is the title slide up?
It is up.
Okay. Hi, everyone. That's a picture of me on the right. I'm Sandy Simpkins. Sorry I couldn't be there today. I have a fractured ankle that has sort of inhibited my travel. But hopefully this will work almost just as well. So, Paul, I'm going to say the word next to go to the next slide.
Got it.
Okay. And so before I get started with some of the findings and the content, I wanted to, of course, thank the funders of my work with NSF, John Templeton, and William T. Grant Foundation. Next. So adolescence is an important time for several reasons. One of the reasons I'm very interested in adolescence is it's a time of more choices, that adolescents are often at a crossroads, as shown in the picture, where they're making not only many decisions, given that they have more autonomy, more time alone, away from parents, but also they're often making, these choices have a great consequence. So, for example, the courses they take in high school could make college majors possible or cut off those possibilities. Also, we have higher risk-taking behavior in adolescence, which also can have severe consequences for their futures. Next. And what's interesting is that when you look at adolescents' time use during their waking hours, and so here you can see a pie graph, and it's actually only 20% of their waking hours are spent in school when you look across an entire calendar year. And so about 20% is spent within school, and about 65 to 80% of their time is actually spent outside of school. Next. And so when you break down that 80% of the time spent outside of school, about 25% is spent on homework and 10% is on other out-of-school time use, such as transportation, getting ready in the morning, eating dinner. But then approximately 45% of youth time outside of, or during their waking hours, is spent in what we call leisure activities. Next. And that time is often spent in, that 45% is spent with families or in organized after-school activities. Next. And I have two areas of research that map on to those two major areas of time use. One is families and STEM. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to talk about that today. We look at what influence parents and siblings have on youth pursuit and motivation in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And here in this bar graph, you can see, for example, some researchers did an experiment where they gave some parents resources about what are STEM careers that are out there, and then also making that connection between the courses that adolescents are taking in high school and the different STEM careers that are available. And the dark blue bars represent the families that they gave those resources to, and the light blue bars are the families they didn't give those resources to. And what you can see here is that actually the youth whose parents got these resources about STEM careers and STEM coursework, that those youth took more science and math courses in high school. They were more likely to have higher achievement in both math and science, so higher grades, higher test scores in math and science. And those adolescents also were more likely to declare STEM majors in college. So that, unfortunately, I don't have time to talk in more detail about that, but families are a major influence in adolescents' lives. Next. What I'm going to talk about or focus on today is my work and other people's work on organized after-school activities. And so that can include art activities, as the picture shows, or athletic activities. It can include school-based activities, community-based activities such as the YMCA, 4-H, Girl Scouts. It's a variety of different pursuits. Next. one of the reasons that people are interested in youth time after school and organized activities is that if in this graph they show the percent of juvenile crime, so this is crime committed by youth 18 and under, and at what time during the day they committed those crimes. And so many people think it's, Friday and Saturday night. It actually is typically Monday through Friday between the hours of 2 and about 8 or 9 p.m. That's what's bracketed in those, between those two red bars. And so one of the benefits of organized after-school activities that people have talked about is that it can play a protective factor in keeping youth occupied doing positive pursuits instead of some other pursuits that might be available. Next. And the research generally shows that organized after-school activities and participating in them does serve a protective factor, that youth who participate are less, they have less aggression, they have less misconduct, less substance use, and that participating in organized after-school activities helps reduce the achievement gap between groups. So it does serve a protective function. Next. Importantly, after-school activities also serve a promotive function, that they not only help protect kids from some of the negative options in life, but they also promote some of the positive aspects of adjustment or of life. And so even though these activities could be at schools or they could be in the community, that there are a lot of academic or school links. So you can see youth who go to organized activities have higher school attendance, higher GPAs. They also have better work habits. So they're more likely to persist on tasks that are challenging at school. They're more likely to turn their homework in on time, do their best effort. And beyond school, or the academic sort of side of school, they also are more likely to contribute to their community. They're more likely to be pro-social, to help others, to be nice kids. Also, they're more likely to be less likely to be depressed, more likely to be happy, and have better relationships with both peers and with adults. Next. And one of these studies that I think is really interesting, they followed youth from 8th grade, they talked to them again in 11th grade, and they talked to them again at 1 year after high school. And there was a group of students in the study, unfortunately, who had poor adjustment. They weren't doing well for a variety of reasons. Some, they may not be getting good grades. Some didn't have positive relationships with friends, right? Some were getting into trouble at school or with the law. And so these were kids that, for a variety of reasons, were experiencing poor adjustment. And as development kind of goes for a lot of kids, if they're on this trajectory of poor adjustment, unfortunately, many kids stay on this trajectory of poor adjustment. But what was interesting, next, is that in 11th grade, they found that some of the adolescents changed course. And they changed course in a dramatic way that you can see at the top of the slide. The youth who looked the same in 8th grade, some of them stayed on this poor adjustment trajectory. Other ones changed, and they were actually 2 times more likely to graduate high school than these kids who sort of persisted or stayed on this sort of poor adjustment path. And as you can probably guess, given the topic of this talk that I'm giving, what's the difference between these two groups? Next is that the youth who changed paths and went on this path of positive adjustment in 11th grade, those kids participated in organized activities in 11th grade. That, again, even though it may not be related to anything at school, that it was something that gave them purpose and positive context in their life, and that actually had implications for them in a variety of contexts, including school. So not only can activities serve a protective and promotive function, they can actually change adolescents' trajectories and sort of their life course. Next. But oftentimes I hear that people just say, great, activities are good, let's just extend the school day. But it's not, activities are different, and that's very important to maintain and to keep, that it's not about extending the school day, it's about providing a different experience for youth. And so when researchers have asked youth, how motivated are you to be in this place that you're in, and how much are you concentrating? when you ask adolescents when they're sitting in school, that they say, unfortunately, they're not very motivated to be there, but they're really concentrating on what they're working on. Next. In contrast, when they're hanging out with their friends or watching TV, they're not really concentrating, but they are very motivated to be there. Next. And then finally, you get to sports, where they get this combination of high motivation to be there and high concentration. And this is, the graph that I'm showing you is in regard to organized sports, but this comes across with other organized activities like art activities and also leisure activities, so readings or things of that nature. That activity settings are different. And what is great about them is that this combination of being motivated and concentrated on a topic are sort of the building blocks of development. It's sort of the active ingredient to get changes in youth. So it's not about extending the school day, but about providing these activities and these opportunities for all youth throughout the state of California. Next. But as you can imagine, and I'm sure many of you know, that not all activities are built the same. They aren't all equally impactful. And some researchers looked at a number of studies to see what's the impact of activities on youth. And so on this graph, you can see 5 different outcomes: prosocial behaviors, problem behaviors, attendance, grades, test scores. Now, the green bars, the lower green bars, are programs that think of them as sort of modest in quality. They're okay, but they're not high-quality activities. Those high-quality activities are shown in the blue. And what you can see here is that the gains, say, on the left side for prosocial behavior with the red arrows, the gains are dramatically larger for that blue bar in prosocial behavior versus the green. And that's the difference between a high-quality activity, which you get in the blue, versus a modest quality activity you get with the green. So it's not only important that all youth have access to these programs, but that also we have funding to help train and support the leaders of these programs. Next. And here in California, I'm proud to say that there have been many initiatives to help support after school in general, access, and also quality. Next. But I also want to push and say that I think quality, as we've traditionally thought about it, isn't enough. That the United States, the world, and the state of California have become very diverse. Next. And that we have to think beyond just some of the basic indicators of quality to really think and consider culture, race, ethnicity, immigration, among other factors that add to the rich diversity within our state. Next. I talked with many youth who attend a variety of programs, and programs for a variety of reasons help bridge differences. I hear youth all the time say that they are friends with people they never would have talked to outside of the activity. They're working on something that matters. They're working together on a project. They're meeting consistently. Next. But unfortunately, I've heard the opposite as well, that despite great intentions on behalf of an after-school leader, that culture is not addressed in a responsive way, rather, unfortunately, a superficial way, and that youth end up feeling marginalized, discriminated against, and misunderstood. So I think creating culturally responsive activities is critical, but we also have to make sure we're doing it right, because if we don't do it right, it can have more negative consequences on youth. Next. And here at UCI, we have a couple initiatives I'm going to tell you about really quick to help address the quality and cultural responsivity of activities. Next. We have a certificate program for our undergraduates where they're taking courses in after-school learning, where I and others are teaching them about quality and what matters. And what's really interesting is a lot of these undergraduate students walk in and think they know what a good activity looks like, and then we start talking, and even a short 10 weeks of a quarter, they come to understand what quality really does look like. Next. And we also have several university community partnerships where we're working with youth on different areas. This is a picture of a math program called Math CEO. It was started by the math department here at UCI, and the School of Education is collaborating with them. And so we serve over 150 Latinx youth from Southern California. And they're middle school youth. Their math ability ranges from kindergarten through high school, but it's an enrichment activity. And these kids are working with undergraduate students, learning about college, learning about STEM degrees, and they're not only learning about math, but learning about the value and importance of math for everyday activities, right? So building that STEM motivation. Next. And that's it. So I'd like to thank you all for inviting me.
Thank you, Sam. I would like to invite Dr. Sandra Graham up as our second panel speaker today.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, I have a simple take-home message. I'm going to tell you my take-home message first, and then I'm going to take my 15 minutes to convince you that it's correct and right. And so all these, I'm Sandra, Sandy, Sandra. So maybe because we share a name, you'll give me an extra minute or two if I go over. Or be sure to hold up something and tell me when I'm. So here's my simple take-home message, and given the theme of this conference on the benefits of schools for adolescent development. So I want to make the argument that greater school ethnic diversity helps adolescents be more tolerant of others who are different from them, develop more integrated social identities, feel less socially vulnerable, and actually be smarter. And I think this is a particularly important topic in this contemporary era where, and I'm going to refer back to this, maybe to the superintendent's data in a minute. So why is it so important to be studying racial ethnic diversity of schools right now in 2019? Let me give you a little bit of context. Now, where's the thing that makes these go forward? To my left, over here. Okay, this one? Or no, I can just use here. Okay. Here, you've probably seen some version of this. This is the changing racial ethnic landscape in the United States over the past century, beginning in 1920. These are 10-year census records. We're getting ready to do another census pretty soon. There's a lot of political discourse associated with that. Let's hope they're accurate. But you can see these are the 10-year census reports from 1920 to 2010 when we had the last one, and projecting out to 2040 and 2060. There's a clear pattern here. In 1920, when there were only 100 million people in the United States, we were a biracial society with a large white population and a very small African American or black population. Over the years, over the generations, over these 10, 20-year periods, our country has become more racially and ethnically diverse. And that dotted line is the critical 50% point. You can see that whites, who were these 90% in 1920, by 2010, they were just a little more than 60% of the population. And by 2040 or 2060, surely, they will no longer be the numerical majority. Latinos, in contrast, are the largest racial ethnic group. Actually, Asians are the fastest growing group. But the point is that by 2040 or 2060, we will have gone in just a century from being a biracial society to a fully multiracial, multi-ethnic society. We are destined to be a country of ethnic minorities. And you can think about this is the population at large, but these kinds of rapid and transformative demographic changes, they're going to occur more rapidly in the under 18 population because of an immigration that's primarily not largely non-white and different birth rates and different racial ethnic groups. So you can see here just over the last 40 years the racial ethnic composition of K-12 schools in the United United States. In 1968, 80% of the kids who went to K-12 public schools were white. By 2015, these data are from the National Center for Educational Statistics. They're always a few years behind in the interest of being accurate. In 2015, as the population at large, the representation of white schools in K-12 schools had dropped to barely a little over 50%. The 2015 in K-12 schools is like the projected 2040 in the population at large. So within another generation, there certainly is no longer going to be a racial, ethnic, numerical majority group, and our schools will be one of the first major institutions in our country without a clear racial, ethnic majority. About 20% of all children under the age of 18 are either immigrants or children of immigrants. And almost half of all children and under the age of 5 are members of a racial ethnic minority. We are in a period of rapidly changing demographics. So you could ask, we're interested in schools. The population is becoming more and more racially and ethnically diverse. Are the schools keeping up with this increasing racial and ethnic diversity? The answer to that question, unfortunately, is a resounding no. Schools, in fact, are more racially segregated now than they have been in the last 50 years, since the early years following the landmark Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. The typical white student, looking at all the schools across the country, attends schools where about 75% of the students are white. The typical African American or Latino student attends schools where at least 2/3 of the kids are members of their racial ethnic group. And these highly segregated schools tend to be concentrated in areas of urban poverty, which makes their challenges even greater. This next figure here shows you the ethnic composition of the 5 largest central city school districts in the United States. New York is the largest. We're right behind them, the Los Angeles Unified School District, Chicago, Miami, and Houston. Just look at the blue. Is it blue down there? Less than 15% of the students in any of these schools are white. These are predominantly racial ethnic minority schools. And it isn't, let me make the case that I'm not saying that there's anything intrinsically wrong with going to school where there are no white students. The problem is that concentrated, highly segregated schools are also tend to be associated with concentrated poverty, which puts these students at even greater risk. The superintendent, I wish I had done a little research on Sacramento schools. When I give talks wherever I am, I try to look at the demographics of the schools where I am. All those reds that he showed you in the Sacramento school district, I would hypothesize that there are a lot of very segregated schools in those inner city areas. So this is a problem that we're facing, and it's actually getting worse. In 1968, only 10% of Latinos in California attended schools that were 90 to 100% minority. By 2010, 55% did. This is a moving target. I think it's even more now. So this is new from last year. From 2001 to 2014, the percentage of public school students with majority, that is over 75%, poor Black and Latino youth increased from 9% to 16%. Well, you may think that's not very much, but there are 56 million kids attending K-12 schools in the United States. So this increase of 7 or 8% is a lot of kids. And so this is really especially important time for us to be worried about this, because the Supreme Court continues to roll back all of the progress that was made in the years following Brown v. Board of Education. The last Supreme Court decision in 2007 declared that it was unconstitutional to create schools that were designed to ensure or maximize racial diversity. I've got a bunch of scary quotes. I'm just going to put one up here right now from the Commission of Civil Rights from 2006, where they said, there are many things we need to do to address the achievement gap, the racial achievement gap, but worrying about the racial composition of schools is not one of them. Really? I want to ask that commission. This is the racial achievement gap. This is data from NCES in 2016. This has not changed in a generation. You can see that the racial achievement gap is big for white, Black versus white, Latino versus white in reading and math. Each of these points is about 1/10 of a school year. So we're talking about kids that are 2 to 3 years behind. And it is related to school diversity. This is a figure from 2003, but it's ever so relevant today. On the x-axis is school segregation, measured by a very reliable indicator. High numbers indicate more segregation this is every state in the U.S. And on the y-axis is the black-white achieve. Is that how much I talked or how much I have left? Oh my God. Can't be. Okay, I got to go really fast. This is the black-white achievement gap. This is a linear relationship. As school segregation increases, the achievement gap grows. So we need to worry about this, and it's been easy for critics of any race-conscious policy to increase diversity by arguing that the research is old, it's outdated, it's theoretically impoverished, it focuses too much on black-white differences. So we in my research group have been arguing that what we need is methodologically rigorous research with multiple ethnic groups. It's not just a black-white thing anymore, with good measures of diversity and posing testable hypotheses that focus on how diversity matters rather than if it does. So that's what we try to do in our research program, and we have a working model. I was going to give you an example of each one of these. I will give it until Sandra tells me my time is up. So this is our working model. You start with ethnic diversity. We focus on early adolescence, and we're arguing that greater school ethnic diversity, what are the mechanisms by which it has this protective and positive function for kids? We look at ethnic diversity provides more opportunities for cross-race friendships, greater exposure to multiple ethnic groups, a balance of power between different racial groups. I'll tell you what that means in a minute. And that then leads to more actual cross-race friendships, multiple social identities, less perceived vulnerability, and then these processes then have downstream consequences on intergroup attitudes, mental health, and school functioning. So why this model? Well, this is about adolescence, and these processes are particularly important to understanding adolescent development. Peers and friends in particular are critical to these adolescent years. Figuring identity negotiation, figuring out who you are, who I am, where am I, how do I fit in. This is one of the major challenges or tasks of adolescence. And perceived vulnerability, when we talk about perceived vulnerability, we're often talking about experiences with peer victimization or harassment, which we know peaks during the early middle school years. So this kind of a model is particularly relevant to adolescent development, and what we know about is particularly about early adolescent development. So that's the model. We have a really, I should have put up my slide about our funders, NSF and NICHD, and I want to acknowledge my collaborator, Jana Juvonen, in the psych department at UCLA. So we have a wonderfully diverse sample. We recruited kids in Southern and Northern California, primarily Southern California, but Northern California too, where all of the 4 pan-racial ethnic groups were recruited from schools that varied in diversity, such that sometimes they were the majority group in their school, sometimes they were in schools with 2 balanced groups, sometimes they were in very diverse schools. So we had the full range of diversity across this very large sample, and to achieve a sample from public schools in California, especially in the LA area where the schools are 74 to 78% Latino, we did a strategic job to maximize the diversity in our schools. We have good measures of diversity. I won't go there. Let me just give you, until Sandra tells me my time is done, a couple of examples from our research of how we're studying these processes. So first I want to say a couple of things about friendships. Friendships. Diversity allows more opportunity for cross-race friendships. Cross-race friendships, in turn, then can lead to more positive attitudes about outgroups. They do? Okay, I've got 1 minute. If I had more time, I would show you that yes, and this is Asian kids responding, their friendships with African American, Latino, and white kids, when you have more friendships, you have better attitudes about outgroups. That's a quite robust finding. And if anybody thinks that tolerance towards other groups is not important in this day and age, when I was riding up here this morning, there was the article in the LA Times about Newport Beach, a highly segregated school district, and swastikas at the party, the weekend party with the high school students. And kids were laughing and joking, and they couldn't imagine why anybody would be upset about it. So we know that friendships matter, and and friendships are promoted in diverse schools. They can affect intergroup attitudes. If I had more time, I would tell you about our findings that suggest that greater diversity allows kids to integrate their multiple social identities. And I was going to give a good example with extracurricular activities to be consistent with Sandy's presentation earlier. Diversity, you can study extracurricular activities in terms of their diversity. As extracurricular activities are more diverse, you have these more complex social identities, and they also contribute to better intergroup attitudes. I'm going to just go ahead because don't have time to talk about victimization. Victimization is reduced when schools are more diverse because you have a more numerical balance of power between different racial ethnic groups. The power is not tipped in favor of one group over another. If I had more time, I would tell you about some of the challenges of racial ethnic diversity. I've talked about school diversity as a structural variable. I'm making the implicit assumption that everybody experiences diversity the same way when they walk through the school door. But in fact, diversity is dynamic and fluid, and it's different for every individual. So we've done studies where we're actually looking at the individual exposure to diversity in your classes, and when your classroom exposure is less diverse than the school, you have particular challenges. You do not have as positive attitudes about outgroups, even though your school is diverse, and in fact, that promotes the achievement gap. I wish I had more time to talk about it. So let me go back to what I said at the beginning. I hope in my rapid, I needed probably about 7 more minutes. School diversity certainly helps kids be more tolerant by fostering cross-race friendships. It helps kids develop multiple identities, which have mental health and intergroup attitude consequences. And it helps kids feel less vulnerable because there's a balance of power between different racial ethnic groups. We're just beginning to explore this really important topic, but today's multi-ethnic schools are the perfect context to do this kind of work. Thank you for my whirlwind treatment here.
I'd like to invite Dr. Adriana Managa to come up to give the next presentation.
Hello, everyone. So I'm a cultural developmental psychologist, and the focus of my research has been on new media technologies and socio-cultural change. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about social media and hopefully connect it to schools as well. In today's digital world, adolescents are coming of age in the midst of profound changes and communication practices. In my research, I think of adolescents as trailblazers of new social media applications and platforms. They're often the early adopters, pioneering new channels through which humans experience themselves in relation to one another. Of course, social media has often also given rise to concerns about the negative impacts on adolescents' psychological health and well-being. One approach to this issue has been limitation-focused. So, for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics advises that parents restrict children's screen time with the underlying assumption that every incremental unit spent with technology leads to decreased mental well-being, psychological well-being, because it displaces other kinds of healthier activities such as face-to-face social interactions, reading books, or exercising. However, research suggests that the relationship between screen time and mental well-being is not linear, but rather it's curvilinear. So the Goldilocks principle is that moderate levels, not too much, not too little, is most optimal for healthy social development. So this is recent research. These graphs depict survey data with over 120,000 15-year-olds. On the x-axis is average hours spent with digital media in its various forms, using computers, watching programs, and mental well-being is on the y-axis, and it's based on self-reports of happiness, life satisfaction, social and psychological functioning in everyday life. The solid lines are weekdays, the dashed lines are weekends. So what these graphs show is that actually there's positive correlations between hours of media use and mental well-being up to a certain point. So there are pivot points or inflection points where the association between hours of media use and well-being reverse from positive to negative. So for example, as hours with video games increases, well-being actually also increases. But at the 2-hour mark on weekdays and at the 3-hour mark on weekends, well-being begins to decline. So obviously, overuse is problematic because it might be interfering with the balance between different activities in daily life. But too little may not be conducive to well-being either. So too little screen time can deprive youth of important social information, bonding time with friends, opportunities to learn about themselves and their worlds, opportunities to explore their interests. Whether we like it or not, messaging, Snapchatting, and even online gaming are new channels by which adolescents connect. And there's actually really good evidence accumulating that digital media activities support the development of social competency and positive emotions and intimacy and bonding. So rather than a limitation approach focusing on restricting adolescents' time with media, what I want to argue today is that we need to better understand the specific practices in adolescents' social media contexts so that we can help them derive positive benefits from use, not only for them, but also for their community and for societal well-being. Oops. So one way to examine adolescents' practices is through this transformation framework of social media by Jacqueline Nesi and colleagues. The authors propose that social media are unique social ecologies with features such as asynchronicity or cue absence that transform peer processes such as friendship, peer influence, peer status, peer victimization. So in other words, the features of communication channels shape how interactions are structured, transform what social support looks like, what social competency can look like, what friendship means, how victimization is experienced, and so forth. So traditional peer constructs, such as peer influence and peer victimization, are transformed by 7 major features that exist to varying degrees across different kinds of social media platforms and applications. So asynchronicity, for example, is the time lapse between turn-taking and communication. Cue absence, the degree to which physical cues are absent. Availability, the ease with which content can be accessed and shared regardless of physical location. Permanence, the extent to which content remains accessible after the original interaction or post. Quantifiability is my favorite. The allowance for countable social metrics. So for example, the number of likes or the number of shares serves as a very quick heuristic of the status and value of a post, for example. Publicness refers to the accessibility of information by large audiences. We're seeing mass personal communication, one-to-many forms of communication that have never existed before social media. And then the last affordance or feature is visualness, the extent to which photos and videos are emphasized. And so the potential consequences of these transformations of peer processes include both opportunities for risk and new opportunities as well, for not only youth well-being, but also for societal transformation. So I'm going to talk about some of the psychological risks and opportunities that have been identified. Harsher victimization, we'll start with risks. Harsher victimization, unfortunately, is one of the potential consequences of some of these features. So cyberbullying victims are significantly more likely to report externalizing and internalizing symptoms compared to teens who report victimization offline only. We think that this is because of greater publicness, visualness, and availability make interpersonal violence more scalable and more vivid, and therefore experienced more emotionally intensely. Cue absence can also decrease empathy and increase dehumanization, disinhibition, making bullying itself more cruel and humiliating. Quantifiability and publicness also create powerful new reinforcement structures for bullies as well. The next risk is excessive friendship. So what I mean by here, excessive friendship maintenance, it's the ways that constant availability can lead to greater demands on adolescents' attention, greater labor in maintaining friendships, increased pressure to make sure you like all your friends' photos, increased pressure to maintain those snap streaks, for example. And why this might be a risk is because this can lead to technoference, the interference of technology and face-to-face interactions, perhaps an emphasis on social snacking, sort of more shallow forms of interaction rather than a substantive, nourishing meal with friends. The next risk is external self-worth. Visualness, publicness, quantifiability create a perfect storm for the socialization of identities that are contingent upon external physical appeal. So attention in the form of likes and comments is an important marker of status in adolescent peer groups. And this kind of social currency creates these micro-celebrity cultures where participants are engaging in processes of self-construction that increasingly resemble crafting a brand that is marketable to mass audiences. But there are also new opportunities as well. Social capital, there's new opportunities for both bonding and bridging social capital. So for bonding social capital, adolescents have new ways to forge and maintain close bonds. There's actually evidence for hyper-personal effects of computer-mediated communication due to asynchronicity and cue absence. So this asynchronicity and cue absence can actually help adolescents optimize their self-presentation, which can enhance liking and closeness between friends. So think about when you're in a face-to-face synchronous interaction, you're processing many different cues at once. And when we reduce those numbers of cues, we enhance our ability to plan our message, to edit, self-censor, reflect, select, and transmit preferable cues. And this may be particularly helpful for adolescents who are still learning about intimacy and disclosure and learning social competence. So we gain a lot of agency with our ability to use text, for example, to disguise our feelings or to consider a response before reacting, maybe to evade confrontations. And when we feel a greater sense of personal agency or control in our relationship, that tends to, we tend to have more positive feelings in relationships when we feel like we have agency and we can optimize our self-presentation. Bridging social capital is the kind of social capital such as new information, alternative perspectives. These are the kinds of social resources that are embedded in looser relationships like acquaintances. So through social media, adolescents can engage in social information gathering, observe and learn from people that might not be in their immediate social circle, but they can learn about new opportunities or new points of view through social media and the bridging social capital affordances. And so here we see peer influence as a peer process increasingly magnified and present in adolescents' everyday lives. It's not just at school, it follows them home from school in sort of a persistent contact 24/7 sort of way. I actually argue that this is something that we should capitalize on rather than restrict, and I'll get to more of that in a moment. But the opportunity to build bridges to new connections may be particularly useful for minority youth. So this idea of compensation refers to the multitude of ways that youth can use digital tools to make up for deficits they may be experiencing in their offline lives. So this may mean that youth who are ethnic or sexual minorities in their school contexts can go online and find virtual communities that offer support and validation. For socially anxious youth in particular, that cue absence can help them level the playing field and feel more comfortable interacting with peers and help them to practice social interactions. And then finally, the last opportunity I want to talk about is self-expression. This is a value that we associate with ideals of personal choice and freedom. So in the shift from mass media to new media, we're seeing increasing choices and increasing opportunities to share your thoughts, to express your opinions, and share artistic expressions, for example, with online audiences. And this has become an important way that adolescents write themselves into being, develop their identities. And so I think these new opportunities for self-expression could create pathways of civic engagement and participation, new opportunities for adolescents to find a sense of meaning and purpose. If you've been paying attention to the youth climate change activists or the Parkland High School gun reform activists, you've witnessed how socially media savvy they are. So generations Y and Z, they know how to use effective hashtags like never again to be persuasive. They know how to link people and stories with action. They're coordinating and building coalitions. And I think this is something that we can also harness rather than restricting their technology use. We can harness these kinds of developmental assets and build on their strengths and passions so that we can empower them to use technology in important and productive ways. So new research that I'm conducting with some schools are helping to identify these new opportunities from more of a positive youth development framework rather than thinking of technology as bad and restricting it. We can help them be activists online, and I'm particularly interested in aspects of gender and sexual identity. So these there are longstanding problems with regard to our beliefs and ideologies around gender and sexuality that seem to have harmful effects on young women and sexual and gender minority youth. So mainly I'm talking about what many of us refer to as the heterosexual scripts, which are embedded with values and beliefs that the genders are adversarial and sexual double standards that we've heard about. So ideologies, they exist, these ideologies for gender and sexuality exist in both traditional and new media contexts. They're sort of these cultural narratives or blueprints for what to expect and how to behave in romantic and sexual interactions. And they shape how young women and men might think about themselves, find their purpose in life, and so forth. So many of these heterosexual scripts can be damaging in that they're often objectifying to women. They often depict men as sexually voracious and powerful and desiring to avoid commitment and sexually objectifying women. The idea for women is that they'll derive their self-worth from their physical attractiveness. And we know that these kinds of beliefs and identification with these kinds of ideologies might undermine young women's desires to go into STEM research, for example, STEM fields. So of course, these scripts are both in traditional media as well as in new media, and we can think of a multitude of ways that these ideologies are translated into new media contexts. So for example, LGBTQ adolescents are, by some estimates, they're twice as likely to be cyberbullied online, leading to a host of negative mental health outcomes. We can think about online hate groups, incel, for example, many of you might be familiar with, revenge porn sites and so forth that sort of magnify these gender sexual ideologies and make them harsher. But I'm also really inspired by the young activists that are using social media, places like Tumblr that have become meccas for young people who are exploring their gender and sexual identities online, and also thinking about new ways to construct meanings for gender and sexuality that might be healthier and more inclusive for adolescents and also healthier for young women as well. So the question driving my current research that I'm going to give you a quick nugget into is, to what extent are these social media contexts where youth are constructing new meanings and values for gender and sexuality spilling over into school contexts? So this is the design of the study is meant to examine these dynamic intersections and bidirectional influences between what's happening at school and what's happening in social media context. So we're currently in the recruitment phase right now. We're recruiting a number of different high schools in Santa Cruz County districts as well as Pajaro Valley, so that we can look at variability across high schools in terms of the school structures that might influence gender and sexuality identity development. So we're measuring school characteristics such as the activity level of gay-straight alliances, the availability and accessibility of bathrooms for non-gender conforming youth, how visible queer youth are in social events, for example. And we're also measuring the attitudes and ideologies among their fellow classmates. So we're distributing surveys, asking students about their ideologies, and we're going to test how their ideologies might drive their certain forms of social media use, and then the relative contributions of their adherence and beliefs in these traditional heterosexual scripts, their use of social media, and in sort of these gendered ways, and how that might contribute to their well-being, as well as some academic outcomes as well. And then in addition, we're recruiting a smaller sample in the green box there of LGBTQ youth from these schools to do narrative interviews. So these interviews combine storytelling as a fundamental process of identity development with an audio-visual tour of their social media activities so that we can understand adolescents' lived experiences and the way that they're challenging the gender binary and challenging heteronormativity. And socially constructing new meanings and values. So maybe many of you have heard about new categories that are being created around gender and sexuality, such as scoliosexual or demi-romantic, for example. This is, I think, really indicative of the kinds of meanings that young people are now socially constructing using social media. And so we're going to aggregate the surveys data from adolescents to look at how peer ideologies might shape social media, what the experiences are of LGBTQ youth online, and also look at how the new ideas and new meanings that LGBTQ youth are constructing online might spill over into high school contexts as well. And so our goal is to explore how online and school contexts might influence one another. Right now, most of the research just focuses on online context to the exclusion of school context, and we think that there's more of an overlap than has been acknowledged. And we think this is an important period of the lifespan where we can really harness adolescents' sensitivity, their desire to do something purposeful, figure out what they care about, and imagine new possibilities with peers. We think we can harness this, and instead of thinking about restricting technology use, we can help them see them as collaborators and as participants in these virtual civic spaces. So I think we need more corporate regulation and enforcement against the collection of privacy data, while also allowing, providing more guidance to teens about how to use digital tools in a way that will foster a sense of purpose, connection to others, and investment in well-being in society. Thanks so much for listening.
For our last talk, I'd like to invite Dr. Tori Wynn up to speak on transformative justice.
So good afternoon. My name is Tori Wynn. I am the Executive Director of the Transformative Justice Center. And let me just talk to you today about transformative justice and restorative justice. And as you can see in my title, Restoring Justice and Transforming Education. But first, let me set the scene. Back in the day, when public schools were legally segregated by race, many black students who attended state-sanctioned all-black schools experienced a welcoming environment, and teachers who encouraged students to excel academically and socially thrive. Many of these black segregated schools, especially in the South, were grounded in educating the whole child and every child to be engaged, productive citizens, to live in a racially hostile society. In her book, Their Highest Potential, Vanessa Siddle Walker describes a time when all black schools led by black administrators and teachers prioritized the needs and supported the intellectual abilities of their students. Siddle Walker documents that educators such as principals and teachers of North Carolina's Casewell County Training School ensured that every student not only received high-quality education, rigorous instruction, but also had the opportunity to engage in extracurricular activities. So as Jorge was talking today and earlier Sandy, these activities, after-school activities, are so important. Principal Dillard stated, "It is the business of the school to organize and administer the extracurricular activities and programs so that every student will have a favorable chance to participate under the most wholesome conditions. Even as CCTS, students participate in debate, science clubs, orchestra, journalism, honor society, educating the whole child and every child. Also required teachers to cultivate relationships with and to learn from the families and communities of their students they taught." Siddle Walker talks about the importance of teachers, right? Learning from the students as well as building relationships with the families of the students. Teachers frequently visited local churches, grocery stores, and students' homes to learn more about the places and people to which the children and the youth they taught belong. Regarding families and community members as essential to educational success of their students allowed these educators to ensure that every child reached their highest potential. Today, the experiences of most Black, Latinx, Indigenous students in public schools are far from the community described by Siddle Walker. Based on the data and what's often reported in the news and social media, most public schools have become enclosures preventing students of color from reaching their highest potential. Instead of schools creating humanizing and restoring spaces and learning communities, many of these schools stifle their creativity, intellectual curiosity, and passion. Damon Sojourner describes school enclosures as not just physical structures, but also refers to them as unseen sources that are just as powerful as the physical manifestations. In this sense, enclosures is representative of social mechanisms that constructs notions of race, gender, class, and sexuality, and just as important as the imposition of the physical and unseen. Enclosures embodies the removal, withdrawal, and denial of services such as sports programs, after-school activities, band and arts that are key to the stability and long-term well-being of communities. Sojourner's description of public schools enclosures and how enclosures impact Black and brown youth is best captured in the never-ending data reports about students of color, academic performance, and discipline history, and terms that we use such as the school-to-prison pipeline and achievement gap, which policymakers and educators use to illustrate and discuss the progress of, or lack of progress, of students of color. What we know and what data has been telling us for many years is that nationwide Black and brown students are being suspended at alarming rates. For example, the civil rights data collection reveals that while boys receive more than 2 or 3 suspensions, Black girls are suspended at a higher rate than any girls of any other ethnicity or race. And Native Americans are also suspended at a higher rate than white boys and white girls. Another example locally is in Milwaukee. And let's look at Milwaukee. Black students are suspended 100 more times than white students for similar behavior. And Jorge is not here, but of course we have to talk about Sacramento. So late last year, this report came out about Sacramento, and it talks about the suspension rates of Sacramento. A recent report reveals that the school district in Sacramento County, such as Sacramento City Unified School District, Elk Grove, Natomas, Twin Rivers, San Juan, have the highest number of suspensions for Black males in California. So we're not talking about LA, we're not talking about Riverside, not talking about Oakland, Sacramento County. Black males are 5.4 times more likely to be suspended in Sacramento County than the California average. Sacramento City School District has suspended just over 20% of its Black male students. Then there is the ongoing criminalization of Black and brown youth. They are often over-policed, targeted, and profiled on campus and off campus. Several years ago, we learned and heard and read about the story of Shakara in South Carolina, where an African-American girl was in a math classroom and was dragged by a school resource officer. And now that made headlines all throughout the country. Most recently, in Madison, Wisconsin, another middle-aged student was dragged by a teacher in class, and that teacher has not been suspended. Then we also talk about the school-to-prison nexus, right? Some people call it the school-to-prison pipeline, but Erica Miner, she likes to argue that the school-to-prison nexus is a more accurate as it captures the historic, systemic, and multifaceted nature of intersections of education and incarceration. So when we think about the school-to-prison pipeline, what that is saying is that in these schools, there's a pipeline of having brown and Black students go into prison. But Erica Miners is arguing that it's more complicated than that. It's not only the schools, but we have to look at the history, the policies of the schools, as well as what's happening in the communities. The status and failures of schools provide a humanizing and quality education for students of color should not solely be placed on the shoulders of current administrators such as Jorge Aguilar, who's doing such a great job here in Sacramento, and he's also known for his equity work in Fresno, or Jennifer Chino, who is known for her restorative justice efforts and the Black Excellence Plan in Madison, Wisconsin. Rather, it is a combination and accumulation of the decades of policies and practices that continue to harm the intellectual and physical well-being and development of many Black and brown students. However, knowing that there are many positive possibilities and opportunities within public schooling, the question is, how do we reimagine and transform schools to be places that are welcoming and prior towards the whole child? How do we raise a community of teachers who understand that the lived experiences, institutional barriers, and histories of marginalized and oppressed communities matter? Furthermore, how do we teach and learn in the age of mass and hyper incarceration that the ongoing criminalization of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and differently able immigrant, Muslim, queer, and working class and working poor children and youth. As the executive director of Transformative Justice in Education, we argue that restorative justice and transformative justice are key principles to helping America decolonize public schools and to build a community of learners and doers in a time when we need healing. So what is this thing we call restorative justice? Did I go too far? Oh. So what is this thing we call restorative justice? When most people talk about restorative justice, they talk about harm and they talk about discipline and punishment. However, more attention when we talk about restorative justice need to be on the building of community and the relationships that others. Fanya Davis, who is the founder of RJORD, she likes to talk about restorative justice as this web of relationships. We're all in relationships, and once that web is harmed, we need to come together as a community. We also need to focus on the history, race, justice, and language, and the root causes of institutional and structural racism and the harm that is caused. Along with RJ is transformative justice. And so why transformative justice now? Because when we talk about restorative justice, we're talking about the principle of building community and harm. But when we talk about transformative justice, we have to get to the root causes: economic, social, and political harms that impact the child and family. Howard Zier, he says, a transformative justice approach not only addresses individual wrongdoing, but also addresses the harms and obligations inherent in social and economic and political systems. So earlier when Jorge was talking about these red areas, if you know the history of most cities, when you see red areas, that's redlining, right? When we talk about social harms, we have to address racism. When we're talking about political, we have to talk about mass incarceration. We have to talk about voter suppression and the war on drugs. When restorative justice, along with transformative justice, are combined together, youth begin to develop a critical consciousness. Critical consciousness allows individuals to think about the makeup of their society, what oppression looks like. They like to ask questions of why. A lot of students across campus, on high school campuses and college campuses, they use the term woke, right? And Erykah Badu was the first person to talk about being woke. Now everybody's talking about being woke, but basically being woke is having a critical consciousness. Maisha Nguyen in Justice on Both Sides, Transforming Education Through Restorative Justice provides 4 pedagogical stances for us to look at a restorative justice. First, history matters, right? If you are a teacher or educator at the university, you should know the history of the community where the university sits. If it's indigenous lands, and if you're at UC Davis, you should know the history. You should know the history of, if you're a teacher at a school in LA. Race matters. How is race impacting the community of students you are in? Justice matters, and language matters. Imagine, if you will, that yesterday or today, you are a student in Sacramento, and you attend a school in South Sacramento. You live in a community where Stephon Clark was shot and where he also grew up. Today, your community and the rest of Sacramento is protesting. Your teacher begins the day in a circle because your school has a restorative justice culture, not a program, but a culture that is building community and relationships and then repairing harm. Your teachers ask all the students to think about the events through the 4 pedagogical stances. Race matters, history matters, justice matters, and language matters. And then your teacher also asks you to think about future matters, meaning your future matters. That exercise of imagining if you lived in Sacramento and you were a student is the exact same thing that we did in 2017. In 2017, we invited over 30 scholars to UC Davis, the School of Education, to address harm that's been done on campus and off campus. Scholars, practitioners, and educators participated in a symposium entitled Toward a Transformative Justice in Teacher Education. We wanted to think collectively about how teachers in schools across the U.S., Madison, Ferguson, Los Angeles, Oakland, Sacramento, Charleston, would respond to an injustice or harm on or off the campus. Our goal was to discuss what would restorative justice look like implemented across school disciplines and subject matters. We began the convening with the following question: what does it mean to teach and learn in an age of hyper and mass incarceration? And as a team of scholars, we came up with a framework of how restorative justice and transformative justice can be implemented for high school and classroom teachers. And you cannot really see the framework, but what I want to share with you are highlight a couple things. The first is a spotlight on transformative justice math. Remember when I talked about Shakara in South Carolina and her being dragged in the math classroom, right? Well, these educators wanted to come up with a couple points, acknowledging that harm has and is happening and through math. Harm happens in math. Reclaim the radical histories of mathematics, learning, and development, especially for Black educators and Latinx within Freedom Schools. Then there's this spotlight on transformative justice in science. Teachers need to integrate their very own traumas. So we can't talk about our students and the traumas that they're experiencing unless teachers begin to look internally and figure out what's going on with them. Teachers need to take a transformative justice approach and understand their communities, the communities they teach in, the histories of the individuals, the change in demographics of those communities. Transformative justice in ELA. Transforming our relationships with ourselves and others and our languages practices. So the way we talk to students, what languages are being spoken in our communities, right? We need to have an understanding as teachers and as educators not to discriminate. And then back to transformative justice in social studies. Race matters, history matters, justice matters, and language matters. So future, what does schools look like in the future if you were to take a transformative and a restorative justice approach? In the future, schools will be humanizing and restoring learning places where teachers cultivate relationships with and learn from families and students. History will matter, race will matter, justice will matter, language will matter, and futures will matter. To get to this place, we expect and demand that teachers educate the whole child and every child, and that teachers see their students with the highest potential. If we go back to my title, schools, criminalization of youth, mass incarceration, and justice, those are heavy words to use when we're talking about education. But unfortunately, that is the status of our schools when we talk about students of color. One of the things that I don't like doing is sharing the data around suspension rates, because every year in Sacramento, if you're in Madison, it's the same numbers over and over. People begin to internalize those numbers, right? And their stories begin to not be told by others. All they do is see students as being suspended and not seeing students and understanding what the students are actually going through, right? And so at UC Davis, when I teach, all my students, they understand the 4 pedagogical stances. History matters, race matters, language matters, and justice matters. So hopefully you all understand that restorative justice is needed. When you hear restorative justice in the schools, understand that if all the teachers aren't trained, if the administrators aren't trained, that means restorative justice isn't happening. And also, if it's not combined with transformative justice of understanding the root causes, restorative justice probably won't work, because it's not a program. It's a paradigm shift in the way we look at our communities. Good. Thank you.
I want to thank our panel members today for their contributions and everyone for attending today, for your interest and your questions, and to the UC Center Sacramento for allowing us to host this event here. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for being such an attentive audience.
Thank you.
Late in the day.